Hey everyone, welcome back to Add Your Faith Ministries Synoptic Gospel Study. I'm Elizabeth Lanu Bardhan, and today we're looking at Mark chapter 7 for lesson 137 on Jesus healing the deaf and dumb Gentile. Now, if you'll look at verse 31, we'll go ahead and read from there. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looked up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Okay, so this is such an interesting story. This one's only found in Mark, so we don't have any parallel passages in Matthew, Luke, or John. Now, this is in Gentile territory, as I said. Last week we looked at the Syrophoenician woman, and then he leaves the region of Tyre, where she is, goes through Sidon, and he's on the Sea of Galilee, on this Gentile side, in the region of the Decapolis. Decapolis was a 10-city area of the Gentiles. Now, the last time Jesus was here, he healed the demon-possessed man, and the demons went in the pigs. That story, they asked Jesus to leave because of him costing them so much money and all that. But Jesus told the man that was healed, when he wanted to follow Jesus as a disciple, Jesus told him to go tell his people, his family, his area, about what Jesus had done. And so the assumption is that that man, as a witness of Christ to the Gentiles, was spreading the fame of Jesus, so that when Jesus came, these Gentiles knew who Jesus was, and they were ready to see what Jesus was going to do. So they trusted that he could heal him because they'd already seen healings or heard of the healings from the demon-possessed man, is the most likely thing. Since the Jews and Gentiles didn't associate, it would be very difficult for them to know about Jesus, right? So anyway, he comes to this Gentile area, and they bring him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. Now, later on, they referred to him as mute. So it was a very severe speech impediment that kept him from speaking, but probably not completely mute, or it would say that in this first description. But he was completely deaf. Now, it doesn't say if he was deaf from childhood or if an injury had happened, what it was, just as deaf. So they begged him to lay his hands on him. So they told Jesus, lay your hands on him and heal. Now, we've talked about this before. We have to be careful about giving Jesus instructions and saying this is how to do it. But often that's what happens. So they bring him and say, just lay your hands on him and heal him. Now, sometimes Jesus did heal that way, but this time he took him away from the crowd privately. Now, we know that when it says crowd, there were tens of thousands of people sometimes that were pushing in on Jesus, trying to get healing, trying to get a blessing. It was real intense. And so he takes him to the side privately. Now, I think it's such a thoughtful gesture. Now, think about this deaf guy. He cannot hear what they're asking Jesus to do. He doesn't know what's happening unless they've written it down for him. So we have this guy who may be very confused, doesn't know why he's in this crowd with Jesus, and so Jesus takes him to the side privately. And then Jesus does some odd things. Not really odd for Jesus in the sense that he does this kind of healings before, but he spits and sticks his fingers into the man's face. So if you remember when he was healing a blind man one time, he spit in the mud, spit on dirt, made mud, and put it on the man's eyes. Well, this time he spits on his finger and puts it in the man's mouth, and then he puts his fingers in the man's ears, then spits on his finger and puts it in the man's mouth. Now, as he's doing that, he says an Aramaic word, which is Ephphatha, and as he's looking up to heaven, which Ephphatha means be opened. Now, the most interesting thing is that Jesus sighed. Why would Jesus sigh? He looks up to heaven. He sighed. And some translations say deeply sighed. And he said to him, Ephatha, that is, be opened. And his ears were open, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. So for the healing, Jesus does not do what they ask, but instead, spitting on his fingers and plugging them in his ears and mouth, speaks in Aramaic, be opened. And as he's looking up to heaven, so you see this, like, he's got his fingers in the guy's face, he's in this prayer position looking up to heaven, and he sighs, like, Ephatha. Now, why would Jesus need to sigh? Normally we think of sighing as an expression of exhaustion, an expression of frustration or anger, an expression of relief, like, why would Jesus need to sigh? I think sometimes we forget the humanity of Christ in our focus on his deity, and this could be tired. There's this whole crowd that's pushing on him, and he needs to be able to focus on this person and give this person a moment. It could be his sadness over the human condition. He made humans not to be deaf, not to be mute. That was not a part of the original design, and how sin and disease and destruction had caused this man to be sick, and it could be a sigh of sadness over just what needed healing, and it could have been the spiritual energy that needed to be given to do this healing. Whenever you serve the Lord, teaching, preaching, healing, there's a spiritual drain that happens. That's why, like, seminaries and churches are usually closed on Mondays, is to give the pastor time to recover from Sunday, to get that spiritual and emotional energy recharge. And so in this, it could have been Jesus's just energy going out to do the healing. I don't know why Jesus sighed, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about. We don't think about God sighing, because it's normally associated with sadness or frustration. But I think the best thing is just as he has his hands in this man's face, and it's just this, like, very intimate healing. He's has to be very close to this person. That as he's doing it, his sigh, just reflecting maybe pity on what this man has went through, or sadness that, how much the world has corrupted and resulted in this man having this problem. Whatever it was, Jesus sighed and said, be opened. And it was opened. He could hear, and his tongue was loosed. He no longer had the speech impediment. He could speak plainly. So the people's response was, they were astonished beyond measure, saying, he has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Beautiful testimony of Christ. He does all things well. And of course, anytime we hear an expression like he makes the deaf hear and the mute speak, always kind of reflects back to Isaiah in the prophecy that the Messiah would come and he would heal the deaf and the blind and the mute, and the lame would walk, and that would be a sign of the Messiah. But these are Gentiles, so when they say it, it is in literal just amazement at having just watched Jesus heal a deaf mute man. Now, in verse 36, and Jesus charged them to tell no one. So Jesus tells them, don't tell anybody. He's already got too many crowds pressing on him. And the more he charged them, so like the more intensely he said, don't tell, the more zealously they proclaimed it, with more excitement and passion that they told everybody. Today I was teaching on evangelism at church, and it's just so interesting to me that when God tells us to go speak, he tells us to evangelize, we're often silent about it. But when he says, don't speak, then these people just couldn't stop speaking about it. Obedience is hard, apparently, for us when it comes to speaking. And it's interesting that this man's speech was healed, but he was told not to use it. So Jesus had reasons that he didn't always share for why he didn't want more people to know about what he was doing, especially in this Gentile region, because that's not why he was there. But at the same time, when he does tell us to speak, we need to obey, and need to be zealous when he tells us to be zealous, rather than when he's saying not to be zealous. So This is just a short one today, since it's only one chapter, one book that has this story. But I think it's just an interesting way that Jesus healed this man by saying, be opened. And I think sometimes we need to ask, do our ears need to be opened spiritually to hear what God is saying, and our hearts to be softened, and our mouth to be loosed to speak what he wants us to speak? And, of course, this was a literal healing of a person who actually had a physical issue that Jesus healed. But, just an application side, when we think about that terminology, is there aspects of your hearing that need to be opened, or of your speech that need to be loosed? Do you need to be spreading the good news of Jesus Christ? Do you need to be speaking what he said to be speaking? Does your lips need to be loosed to be able to do that? And do your ears need to be opened so that you can hear from the Holy Spirit? And if you've hardened your heart and ignored stuff that he said many times, then you may not be hearing so well. And it may be time to ask for him to open up your hearing, your spiritual hearing and your spiritual speech, so that you can serve God the way he wants us to serve him. So that's about all for this lesson. I hope it's a blessing. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them on the video, and I will try to get back to you soon. Thanks. Bye.